I'm Sienna. I'm the kid.
I'm Sarah. I'm the mom.
This is Queer Kid Straight Mom.
Let's talk. Welcome back to Queer Kids Straight Mom. Today we are joining the rest of the world in talking about Heated Rivalry.
Except for Russia, where they're trying really hard to talk about Heated Rivalry, and then their streaming services are getting sued by the government.
Oh, I was wondering how that is all happening over there, like playing such a prominent role and being such a famously unfriendly place to LGBTQ people. So because everybody is talking about this, we also know that everybody has some kind of opinion about it. I think I can safely say that we both loved it. I don't know where to even start. There's so much. One of the fascinating things is like how broad the appeal is across groups and even straight men, which I think is the most surprising demographic to embrace this. But it's great to see. You had mentioned once, I think when you had watched it before I had, that there were a lot of storyline similarities to Heartstopper, kind of like a grown-up Heartstopper.
Yeah, not even similarities either, but like stylistically, there are some similar elements. They use texting in a really similar way.
Yeah, that's true.
Musically, I think there's a little bit of overlap.
Yeah, and a couple of those scenes, like, I suppose there will be spoilers, right?
Yeah.
The scene where Scott brings Kip out to the ice, so much, like, even though it wasn't as public, like that moment at the end of the first season of Heartstopper when Nick like goes over to Charlie and takes his hand in the rugby game, like that same like sort of vibe, right? Which was like such a feel good moment.
And I think there's the same like core sort of sweetness to it.
Even though it's very adult in its content.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like that emotional core is still kind of similar.
Yeah, because it is for these guys, even though they're adults and obviously much more experienced in ways in the world than Nick and Charlie, there's a figuring it out, sort of uncharted territory that does have that sort of adolescent sweetness in a way that I think is appealing. So I think there's that. There seems to be this constant, like, I want to watch it more than once. I feel like I'm crazy because I want to watch it again.
No, but I think this sometimes gets lost. Like, there are so many references to it as basically being softcore porn, whether jokingly or seriously. But I think what gets lost in that is that it's actually a really well-written, well-crafted show. The fact that I'm out here using literary terms like foil when I'm talking about it,
Yeah.
like, it's really tight. It's really well-crafted. And I do think that a little bit of that gets lost when we think about it as just like a fluffy romance show because it's well done.
Yeah, I think that is true. And a lot of what I'm seeing is like, I want to go back and look for like all of these cues. Like, what was the moment where like he first felt that way? Or what were the signs of this? Or, like because it's such good character development. And because you realize that there were so many subtle things that they did well that you want to go back and like find them.
One interesting thing that I think it also does really well is there's always this balance, and we talked about it a little bit in our Stranger Things episode of what are you trying to accomplish with the show? What kind of show are you trying to create? And how do you balance not wanting to create like a really heavy traumatic show with also acknowledging the realities of homophobia? And I think that like that's something this show does quite well, in my opinion, because it's not beating you over the head with it. As no one's getting beat up because they're gay, but it is still the sort of underlying thing. And there are these little moments that I think a lot of straight people might not necessarily pick up on immediately. But then, going back and thinking about it, going back and rewatching it, maybe you do. And queer people, I think, are sort of primed to pick up on them immediately because it is the sort of thing that we're always picking up on these cues. Like, is this a safe space for me? So, like, a good example of that is when, like, early on, Shane is talking to his parents about Ilya and his mom is like, oh, he's, whatever, he's such a jerk. Like, he can take it up the ass. And it's not explicit. It's not like her being like, gay people deserve to die. But it's this subtle little thing that says, I look down on this. I'm using this as an insult that is cueing Shane to not want to come out to his family.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That's interesting from the perspective of people that are always kind of looking for those kind of things. And that parent role is really interesting. Like, people my age. I think there was also an appeal the way that Heartstopper did in that non-traumatic love story kind of thing of as a parent with children, especially because at my age,
Boomer.
like I remember a world, we talked about this with Stranger Things too, right? That in that era where I grew up, I'm younger than those Stranger Things kids. But, I was still sort of a teenager in that time when it was really, I think, terrifying for gay people for somebody to find out they're gay, right?
Mhm.
So we remember that. We remember what that was like for our friends that I now know these guy friends were gay. And we probably could have been yeah, I wouldn't be surprised as teenagers, but it never came up,
Mhm.
even though they had to know that we, as their really good friends, would be a safe place. It never came.
Mhm.
And so, imagining what the world would be like for a queer person growing up and then getting to see these stories now that it doesn't have to be traumatic.
Mhm.
And certainly there are challenges,
Mhm.
but it's so heartening, I think, for parents to see that having a queer child doesn't mean that their life is going to be this sad, heartbreaking after school special.
Mhm.
Right. And so I think that is part of it, especially for women my age, is not only is this incredibly sweet story, but it's so hopeful. It's
Mhm.
so hopeful that these stories can be accepted and viewed as great romances
Mhm.
instead of just a tragedy.
Mhm.
And then, of course, there has been a lot of chatter about why do straight women love this show? And that is a question that's brought a lot of controversy and I think you can kind of give people more of a background on why that is controversial, why there's an immediate reaction of of course they do.
Yeah, this is something that I really struggle with personally because as a first blush rule, I always try to be like, you know what? If people want to enjoy queer media, it is none of my business why they do it. Because I think interrogating that, especially with people you don't know well, random strangers on the internet, ultimately does a lot more harm than it does good. That being said, there's been this weird trend that actually, I mean, really it dates back to the beginning of fan culture. We've talked about fan fiction and archive of our own and how much of that the OG couple is Spock and Kirk,
Okay.
Star Trek, and how much of that is fueled by straight female fans. Now, for a lot of
Oh, it'd be so hot if these guys were together.
right.
Okay.
Now and
Spock and Kirk, really?
I
I'm gonna take it back to your if that's a thing, then who am I to judge?
But as I think internet culture has really blossomed and sort of merged more with the mainstream, I think that subculture has also become really a lot more mainstream and popular
Mm.
to the point where them had a ins and outs of 2026 and one of the ins was fujoshing. Now, fujoshi, or as it's often used in meme lingo, fujoing out, is a Japanese term that was once used only in the weebiest, most anime-obsessed corners of the internet. But now, fujoshi has breached containment and appears to be on track to join the general internet slang lexicon. There is, in fact, a long and rich history behind the term fujoshi, and even an entire academic disciplines devoted to studying the social behaviors of self-identified fujoshi and the media they consume. Can confirm because I actually did write a paper on this. So fujoshi is a Japanese term that basically originated in describing straight women who were really into BL, which is boys love comics. There's overlap then with Chinese culture. I don't know if there's a specific word for it, but there's a significant subsection of web novels in China, also described as BL, that are romances between two men. And those are primarily written and consumed by straight women. And I did actually write an entire paper about danmei in Chinese, the genre, and its cultural significance. So yeah, can confirm that that is an academic thing. It's basically just this idea of you're a girl who's really into reading about gay men. That was an article from them also. And some of the examples it gives, right, are things like challengers, that Zendaya's character is basically fujoshing out over trying to get her boyfriends to kiss. And also, again, all of these kind of classic fan fiction couples, which we've talked about before. But it has really become this mainstream thing. And what I've never understood about this, why we're acting like it's this great, cool thing, why them would describe it as an in of 2026, is that from my perspective, queer women have been complaining for years and years and years about being objectified by straight men and having their relationships with other women treated as though they exist solely for the sexual gratification of straight men. And there's a different power dynamic at play, obviously, between straight women consuming media about queer men versus straight men consuming media about queer women, right? That there's not the undercurrent of violence and domination that comes along with straight men. But it still feels like it's treating queer people as though their existence is not valuable in and of itself, or their existence is for queer people themselves, but instead for the gratification of straight people. And that bothers me.
Yeah. I saw somebody saying, I think it was a queer man saying that, they make this gay male relationship look so like hot and amazing. And it is really forgetting a lot of the trauma that is ingrained in sort of the way that queer men have been objectified over the years
Mm-hmm.
and the abuse. And a lot of this is, also from men, but that hotness or whatever has led to a lot of abuse. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of like, if you're a gay man that is desperate for money, or, there's just a lot of ways that being a hot gay man has been a really hard place to be in
Right.
society. And so when you see a glamorous version of it and you're like, that's so great, that feels a little bit like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, queer men have been extremely hypersexualized. And I actually do think that, something that Heated Rivalry does well is that, it starts off as this very like sexual, intense relationship that then is given the space to become something more,
Mhm.
which is something I appreciate. But yeah, I do think it's true that if you have associated a lot of that with trauma and with violence, then seeing it treated by straight people is just like, this is great. This is so hot. Love it. Like it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, I can see that. And I do think that is not everybody. Like a lot of what I have seen across the demographic board from straight women, straight men, queer people is like this isn't all toxic. Like
Mhm.
a lot of it is that like yearning has universal appeal, and that what people really love is just because people like get really into movie like great love stories about
Mhm.
straight people too, when there's that sort of long, complicated, I can't be with this person for whatever reason,
Mhm.
yearning, right?
And I mean, I think, yeah, that's why, there are very, very few situations I'd be comfortable like actually saying, wow, you're being problematic because you only like Heated Rivalry because you think it's hot and you're a straight lady and that's not cool. Like, there's very few behavior that I think that's really appropriate response to, especially because, as that article pointed out, there has been a lot of like research that's been done because people are like, what is it about queer relationships between men that women are finding so appealing? And it's not just the sex, right? There's also an aspect, and I've seen some people say this specifically in the context of Heated Rivalry. A lot of women find that it's more enjoyable to watch a romance between two men because you're not comparing yourself to one of the characters, right? That it is completely free from the expectations that get attached to the female body, the power dynamics that come
Mm.
along with a male female relationship. I mean, like if you're watching a lesbian movie, then all of a sudden there's two hot women you have to compare yourself
Yeah,
to.
that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but specifically, but I can see that. Yeah, it does kind of free you from the like, I'm supposed to look like that to have this
Mhm.
kind of story or whatever it is. That's a really interesting point. And I think it's probably why, when you do find men that are like, I don't want to watch naked guys. You're
Mhm.
like, we've been forced to watch naked women for all of eternity. And fine, but like it is hard. You do
Mhm.
compare yourself. You do feel inadequate. You do feel like this ideal is being held up that you can never live up to. And now we're freed from that. And guys are like, my abs don't look like
And like,
that.
well, this sucks. Wait a minute. I mean, I do think, like I was saying this earlier, that I mean, even as like a just sort of vaguely transmasculine person, I watch Heated Rivalry and I'm like, this is giving me a lot of body anxiety. I don't want muscles like that. What the heck?
Yeah.
And so I do imagine that, men of any sexual orientation watching it could very, very much feel like they're being presented with a similar kind of unattainable beauty standard that women have been presented with for like all of cinematic history.
Yeah. I think that's true. You said something about them being on equal footing too.
Mhm.
And I had also seen that part of the appeal of this is that because these two are like equally athletic, equally talented, they're both good looking, they both have amazing bodies, they're both all of these things, that they're meeting in an equal place.
Mhm.
And so there isn't an unhealthy power dynamic in that way. which I think is mostly true. I have a couple of I think from the beginning, Ilya's a little more like, well, I've already accepted this as kind of being a thing that I do. So he does have a little bit of assurance that is a little bit dominant over Shane. But my friend Sarah and I were talking about this on a walk yesterday. I can see the equal footing thing and why that is true and that is appealing. But why? And so I was thinking about reasons that that would be particularly appealing to straight women.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that no matter how evolved straight men are and how modern most of the love stories we see in the media are, no matter how powerful the woman is, successful, whatever, like no matter how equally matched they seem, there are these stereotypes that people fall back into just very subtly. And I think that men have always been sort of, supposed to be stoic and a little bit emotionally repressed, and that it's okay for them to show their emotions when they're in love with this woman, right? In these great love stories. And that is really appealing because you're seeing this man like kind of let down his guard and be vulnerable, right? They feel safe doing that with the woman they love because women are inherently subconsciously supposed to be nurturers, right? And so we, no matter how equally our partners see us, often fall back on even on a very subtle level to being the emotional backbone of the relationship. And I think that it is just incredibly powerful watching two men have to negotiate that when they're both men. That is not an automatic, you are the emotional backbone of this relationship. Sometimes it's you, sometimes it's you. You have to figure that out and get to a place where you're being vulnerable with somebody that you have not been, systemically programmed to see as the person that it's safe to be vulnerable with. And I think that's just really appealing because you are getting to see that vulnerability that is really attractive without having to be the person that's societally expected to allow men to be that.
Right. I think and it's not even a matter of what dynamics exist in an individual relationship between a woman and a man. There's always going to be, because a relationship can't exist in a vacuum, right? We're always going to be perceiving it through the lens of, regardless of whether I think that a person of a particular gender should conform to certain stereotypes, those currents are still underlying society. And so we have to sort of take them into account when we're perceiving something. So yeah, I think a relationship between two men, and crucially, right, two men who are both pretty masculine. Obviously, there's like the specific sexual dynamic between Ilya and Shane, where Shane is a bottom and Ilya is a top, and like, okay, whatever. And a lot of times, because being a bottom is considered equivalent to being a woman, right? I mean, there's, again, all sorts of really interesting research in all various cultures about that a lot of times that person gets shoehorned into being the more like submissive, nurturing one. But that's not true in every relationship. And that's not what happens in Heated Rivalry. And I think it's great, right? That we see Shane and Ilya both having to like lean on each other and ask for support from one another and be vulnerable with one another. And that neither of them gets shoehorned into a specific role based on what sex they enjoy.
I think that's true. So yeah, I think there's some just gender role stuff that is refreshing to watch the love story without whatever, I suppose, unless you're a gay man. For everybody else watching this, to watch this love story without whatever like personal baggage that gender roles have assigned to you, right?
But then again, like, maybe that's part of why there are some queer men out there who are like, but I don't feel like this was made for me though.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the people finding catharsis from it is everyone but gay men.
I guess I can see
It's
that.
not universal, right? There are definitely queer men out there who enjoy it, but a lot of these things we're talking about, right, are things that benefit women of all sexual orientations.
I suppose that's true.
So, you can see how you might end up feeling like a little bit like, well, this is supposed to be about me, and it doesn't feel like it's about me.
That is kind of interesting. And I have seen the criticism that the books were written by Rachel Reed, who is at least not an out queer person and is obviously not a gay man or a bisexual man. And, can she really accurately portray this relationship? But I have also seen in reference to the show that the producer, Jacob Tierney, is gay. But that, in developing the TV show, there was that perspective. There was a gay man's perspective. And so it is kind of selling it short. And I don't know, you have started the books?
I haven't actually
You
started
haven't
reading
started,
them yet.
okay, and
I've seen some excerpts from them.
I haven't read them either, so I can't I don't know, it'll be interesting to compare.
Mhm.
But the show, at least, is certainly told through the lens of a gay man adapting
Mhm.
the script.
And I think that's how we get some of those elements that do really resonate with queer people.
And that's good, that's important.
Mhm.
We certainly want that to be a step in the process. I think the sports setting is also really fascinating in this because male athletes it's, like, fascinating. I know you have your own theory about all sports being gay. But I think it's really interesting because male athletes are allowed to get so emotional about some things,
Mhm.
and then they're not supposed to be emotional about other things.
Mhm.
And there's so much like, "I love these guys." And so it's fascinating to watch, "Oh, like, I actually love this guy,"
Mhm.
in that context, and kind of figuring out how to deal with that. And, in their situation too, like, I love him and I want his life to be good, and also I have to beat him because I'm a competitor.
Yeah, this is so funny to me though because it's like, "Oh, this is a new problem." And it's like, "No, lesbians have been doing this for ages."
Yeah, that's true. It would be kind of fascinating to talk to some of those lesbian couples that are professional athletes.
Well, there are articles about them because I think I can't remember if it's two women who are gonna be representing different countries in the Olympics or if they play on different teams within the same country and they're gonna be on the same team in the Olympics, but, like, two women who are, like I don't know if they're married or whatever. Clearly, I have not researched this quite enough, but, like, that is, like, a thing that happens pretty I mean, there are so many couples in the WNBA
Yeah.
who are playing against each other all the time. Frankly, it's quite funny to me because I'm like, I would be playing against each other is one thing, that's fine. I'm worried about having, like, a married couple on the same team.
Yeah. Because if they're fighting, then who knows?
Right.
Yeah, fascinating. But I would love to hear their thoughts on how accurately or not accurately they kind of went into that.
Well, and apparently in the books, Shane spends, like, a whole lot more time agonizing over, "But we're rivals. Oh, no,
Oh,
I'm sleeping with my rival," which you
okay.
don't really get in the show, I feel like.
Yeah, not as much. Another facet of this story and inclusivity and all of that, which I didn't really pick up on, but read it and was like, "Oh my god, that makes so much sense," is Shane being autistic,
Mhm.
and realized that that was actually intentional in the character.
Mhm.
But it really explained some things for me that I was surprised by from the very beginning of the show, in that he would be in these, like, situations with Ilya, and, like, it's new territory for him, and there are all these stereotypes, and there are all these, like, reasons that you can't be gay and be a professional athlete and all of that stuff, and that he still seems so, like, straightforward about what he's doing and what he
Mhm.
wants. He's struggling because what does this mean for me as a hockey player, and what does this mean for my family, and what does it mean that nobody can know about this? But he doesn't seem, at least from the way I perceived it, to be, like, deeply struggling with accepting that he's gay and saying it out loud is a journey that he goes through.
Mhm.
But it does not seem as distressing to him to be attracted to a man
Mhm.
as I was expecting it to be. And I'm wondering if that is part of being more matter of fact about things.
Mhm. Yeah, that's an interesting one to me too because I would not have necessarily picked it out and said based on the show like, "Oh, that's an autistic character. I really relate to that." It's not the way him being autistic manifests is not something that I necessarily relate to a ton, but there are a lot of people who it seems like have related to it, and I think that's just a really good example of like not every piece of representation has to like you don't have to emotionally relate to all of it. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be describing your story every time. There are different experiences. There's the cliche, like, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person.
Yeah, that makes sense. But yeah, I thought that was kind of a fascinating thing because I've always felt like, not that it made anything necessarily easier for you, but that it has seemed to me, at least, that the biggest concerns for you would be the reactions of people around you rather than it meaning you're not the way you're supposed to be.
Yeah, that, like, we might not be internalizing that there's some sort of actual moral value to being the quote unquote normal way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good way to say it. So I feel like I had sort of observed that in you a little bit, and then reading that about Shane and putting those together, that kind of made more
Mhm.
sense to me. Unfortunately, we're gonna have to wrap this up fairly soon.
But I still have so many thoughts.
Oh, because I've been talking the whole time. This has turned into a straight woman's thoughts about heated rivalry. Dang it. just what everybody needed was more of that. I apologize. We're going to split this episode into 2 parts so it's not really super long.
And this is the happy fun
This
episode.
is
And
the
then
happy
next
fun part.
episode is when we're going to be like, okay, guys,
Yeah.
gentle guidelines here about how we interact with people.
Boundaries. Famous people don't owe you things that are personally gratifying to you.
Connor's story is not literally Ilya Rozanov, which people seem to be having a really tough time with.
Yeah. There is a lot out there about toxic fandoms and parasocial relationships. And let's not force people to be out if they're not out or make assumptions about their sexuality and like a whole bunch of stuff down that road, which Sienna will have better insight as a queer person to speak to. And so that will be less a straight woman's thoughts on heated rivalry and more that perspective. I guess we didn't really spoil anything.
No, I mean, it's a romance. Like, they're going to get together.
You know they're going to get together. But if you haven't watched it, and again, with the disclaimer that if you are under 18 or if you are really uncomfortable with a lot of sex scenes, like it might not be for you. Or I've actually seen people posting like, I think it was specifically if you want to watch it with your parents, skip from here to here, from here to here.
Irene was like, oh, we could watch Heated Rivalry with your mom. And I was like, I'm not doing that. But yeah, I mean, I would say that, in my opinion, one of the trademarks of a very good romance versus like just reading erotica at a certain point is that like the sex scenes actually are sort of integral to the character development and the plot. So be mindful of that. But I would also say, like, if you can get through episodes 1 and 2, and if you like, you want to skip through some of the really intense scenes, I feel like it evens out a lot starting with episode 3.
Yeah, my other friend was like, I'm trying to watch it and I'm only a couple episodes in and I just don't know because is there anything except sex and like really brief glimpses of hockey? We were like, yes, there is. But with that disclaimer, if you haven't watched it, it is really good and we would love to hear your thoughts or if there are any specific things that you would love to hear us. We're trying to kind of hit all of the points that we've seen a lot of chatter about or like significant thoughts we've had about it. But if there's anything that like you feel like should be added to the conversation, let us know. And then
I would especially love to hear other queer folks' thoughts and feelings about this like fujoshing becoming like such a mainstream thing, because it does seem like I'm a little bit like, again, like the online queer magazine is running a thing saying this is in for 2026. And I'm like, I feel like I'm in the minority here about this.
Yeah, let us know. We'll put a poll out there too. Yeah, so look for that and catch you next time.
Bye.
If you found this episode helpful and entertaining, please follow us on your podcasting platform of choice. Look for us on social media, on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky, and visit our website for references and resources. We want to know what's important to our listeners, so if there are any topics you'd like us to discuss, please reach out.